I heard the splash first, the unmistakable plop of something heavy hitting the water, and when I ran out to my dock with my fishing pole in hand, I found myself face to face with a brand new wrought iron gate, gleaming under the sun like some smug monument to absurdity. Behind it, a shiny silver plaque read, "Private HOA access only. Violators will be prosecuted." My dock, my lake, my property blocked off like I was some trespasser in my own backyard. And the best part? A security camera pointed straight at me, blinking red like a robotic middle finger. That's when I knew something stupidly sinister was afoot. And her name, as I'd soon learn, was Linda Pierce. Living by the lake had always been my dream. After 27 years designing highway overpasses and drainage systems, I finally cashed out and moved into a modest A-frame cabin tucked at the edge of Hemlock Lake, a quiet blue haven nestled in a pocket of pine trees. My backyard sloped gently into a patch of reeds that opened up into the water. Every morning, I'd walk barefoot out to the old wooden dock, thermos in hand, and fish in the mist. I paid off the land in full, no mortgage, no liens, and certainly no HOA, or so I thought. That morning, instead of casting a line, I stood slack-jawed in front of the unauthorized gate that now dissected my access to peace. I followed the fence with my eyes black steel bars, stretching out in both directions like some dystopian train track. It ran all the way up to my neighbor's property line, and then snaked back toward the private road, leading to the rest of the subdivision. Who the hell installs a fence around someone else's lake? Access without a single knock on the door. Later that afternoon, the answer came striding up the gravel path in the form of Linda Pierce, HOA president, clipboard clutched to her chest, like it contained the 10 Commandments. She wore a stiff lavender blouse, wedge sandals way too ambitious for gravel, and an expression that could curdle milk. Before I could get a word out, she smiled one of those tight-lipped smiles and gestured toward the gate like she was presenting a grand prize on a game show. "Hello there. We've installed a protective barrier around the lake," she said, as if announcing a town-wide bake sale, strictly for residents within the association. "You understand, of course, liability concerns." I blinked. "I live right there. This is my lake access." Linda cocked her head and laughed like I'd said something charming but wildly incorrect. "Well, technically, the access strip sits on a parcel now maintained by the Hemlock Shores Homeowners Association. You must have missed the notices. We sent several." She tapped her clipboard and held it like a shield. "Safety first, right?" I could feel my blood pressure spike so hard it buzzed behind my eyes. "Linda, I didn't get a single notice. And how did you even get permission to build this? That land's not part of your HOA." "Oh, but it is now," she said sweetly. "The HOA acquired the lease last fall. It was previously managed by the old bait shop owner, bless his soul. Since he passed, it reverted to open bid. We secured it and redesignated it as common HOA property." I stared at her, trying to understand the contorted logic of it. The bait shop, of course, a narrow strip of land between my property line and the lake that had once housed a rickety shack filled with minnows and soda cans. I'd always assumed it was included in my deed or a county easement. Turns out it wasn't, and this woman had slithered in and leased it out like a hawk snatching a rabbit. "Let me guess," I said, voice tight. "You didn't tell anyone who lived nearby." "It was discussed in our October meeting fully above board," she chirped. "You're welcome to submit a formal appeal, though as a non-member, I'm afraid you won't have voting rights." I was stunned. I wasn't even part of the HOA, had bought the land years before the subdivision crept in, yet somehow this neighborhood, Napoleon, had managed to rope off my lake access and declare it private HOA territory without even knocking on my door. The next day, I tried to cut through the gate. I brought my bolt cutters, like some renegade freedom fighter, snipping at tyranny. I barely got through one link before Linda showed up with a security guard in tow and called the sheriff. To his credit, the deputy looked just as confused as I was, but after checking property maps, he confirmed that while I owned the cabin and surrounding land, the parcel with the dock and gate was technically under HOA lease. I couldn't believe it. Linda watched it all unfold, like she was sipping a martini at the opera. By the end of the week, a warning sign went up. "Do not trespass. $1,000 fine." And that ridiculous camera kept blinking, watching my every move. I tried going through the HOA board, attending one of their meetings. It felt like walking into a soap opera run by suburban villains. Every person was either terrified of Linda or completely hypnotized by her delusions of control. One guy said, "You're not on the lake list anymore." I almost laughed. What the hell was a lake list? Then came the kicker. Linda had the only key to the lock. For a few days, I sulked. I mean, what could I do? Hire a lawyer and bleed thousands trying to reclaim a tiny sliver of land with a gate on it, dig a tunnel under the fence like a cartoon prisoner. I even considered building a floating dock off my own shoreline and launching a kayak invasion just to make a point. And then I saw a "for sale" sign posted discreetly on the parcel next to the gated strip. The same land Linda had leased, split by a legal quirk into 2 narrow lots. I pulled out my phone, called the number, and talked to a real estate agent who practically begged me to make an offer. The seller, an elderly woman living in Alaska who inherited the land from her late husband and forgot it even existed. That night, I sat on my porch sipping coffee under the stars, watching the gate glow faintly in the moonlight like some smug steel totem, and I started to grin. If Linda wanted control so badly, she was about to get it, just not the kind she expected. Because I was going to buy the land with the only gate key, 2 weeks later, the paperwork was finalized. The deed was in my name, and I was the proud owner of a narrow, overlooked, and now incredibly valuable strip of land that included the fence Linda had so proudly installed. The kicker? When she leased the adjacent parcel, she'd assumed the other half was part of the same plot, just like I did. But that sliver, the one with the actual gate posts buried into the dirt, wasn't leased. It was for sale, and I bought it for less than the cost of a new fishing boat. It was almost poetic. She'd locked me out, but now I owned the very lock. I waited a week before making any changes, just long enough for the gate to become a permanent fixture in the HOA's mind, for Linda to get comfortable with her little symbol of power. The lake was hosting its annual HOA summer brunch soon, and sure enough, the event was set to take place right on the other side of my former dock, now her exclusive community retreat. I watched the preparations from my deck like a hawk with popcorn. Folding chairs were arranged. A white tent went up. Someone wheeled out a chocolate fountain. I couldn't believe the level of pretentious energy spilling into my backyard. The morning of the event, I made my move. I walked calmly down to the gate, lockpick kit in my pocket, not to break in, but to change the lock entirely. I brought a new heavy-duty padlock, the kind you see on military ammo crates. Click it, snapped shut like a gavel. Then I affixed a fresh sign, nothing dramatic, just a simple message printed on weatherproof laminate: private property. Access by owner permission only. That afternoon, as HOA members showed up in pastel polos and sun hats, Linda marched to the gate, holding a clipboard and wearing a smug grin that could blind small animals. She reached for her key. It didn't fit. She tried again, still didn't work. She jiggled, twisted, even banged it against the gate, growing redder by the second. Eventually, she turned to the gathering crowd and, with the tightest smile imaginable, announced there had been a small technical issue with the lock, but that it would be resolved momentarily. I took a sip of my lemonade and waited for the moment she'd look up and see me. When she did, I waved. Then I tossed her a copy of the deed. She read it like it was written in a foreign language. Her jaw moved, but no sound came out at first. Finally, she stammered, This must be a mistake. You can't just buy community property." I walked up to the gate, leaned casually against the fence, and said, "You're right. That's why I didn't. I bought my property, the one your gate is standing on, including this nice stretch of land, all the way to the big rock there." Linda's face twisted like she'd just bitten into a lemon rind. She scanned the deed again and looked at the plot map, which I had conveniently highlighted in neon yellow. The realization was deliciously slow and painful. She was standing on land that no longer belonged to the HOA, not legally, not at all. "But we installed this gate," she said, voice shrill now. "The HOA funded it, and I own the soil under it," I said calmly, "which means it's mine. In fact, I was thinking of replacing it with a hammock." That got a laugh from someone in the crowd. Linda turned, eyes wide, but the tide was shifting. Several board members looked uncomfortable. A few even looked entertained. Megan, the younger, sharp-witted board secretary, raised an eyebrow and crossed her arms like she'd just seen a plot twist. She didn't expect but fully appreciated. Linda stormed off, cell phone glued to her ear, demanding an emergency board session. I let her go. There was no emergency session to save her from this. The HOA had leased half the property and built improvements onto land they didn't own. I had purchased the other half and, with it, full control of the gate, access, and all associated terms. Legally, the HOA couldn't even touch the gate without my permission. The next day, I filed an official notice with the county clerk. The fence was now marked as partially installed on private property, and any unauthorized alterations would be considered trespassing. I sent copies to the HOA, the sheriff's office, and just for fun, Linda's lawyer, whose email I obtained from a public HOA filing. Then I installed a motion-activated camera and a solar-powered floodlight. The spotlight activated every time someone approached the gate from the HOA side. It didn't record anything. I wasn't trying to catch them. I just wanted them to know I was watching. Linda's retaliation attempts came swiftly and predictably. First, a letter accusing me of sabotaging community morale. Then a second letter from the HOA legal rep citing a clause in their charter about cooperative land usage. My reply was a copy of my deed and a post-it note, "Recuperate this." Megan paid me a visit not long after. She wasn't hostile, just curious. She asked to walk the property line with me. I obliged. We walked the length of the fence, and she shook her head, clearly annoyed. "Linda never ran this through the proper channels," she said. She told the board it was uncontested HOA property. It wasn't. It's just that nobody cared until she installed a gate. Megan smirked. She's going to blow a gasket when the board finds out she spent $3,000 of HOA funds fencing land we don't own. Then I guess she better reinforce that gasket, I said. Over the next few days, things shifted. The HOA's posture softened. Megan began attending board meetings with visible tension. Rumors swirled about internal disagreements and potential misappropriation of funds. One board member resigned, another requested a full financial audit, and Linda, she filed a complaint with the county zoning office. That backfired spectacularly. The zoning official came out, checked the parcel lines, and told her in no uncertain terms that she had no authority over that stretch of land. Worse, she'd have to request formal permission if she wanted to host any HOA events on it. She tried to argue. The zoning guy just shrugged and pointed at the coordinates. He owns it, and it's not under your HOA domain. End of story. By the end of the week, Linda attempted one final desperate move. She hired a locksmith to change the gate lock again. The guy showed up, looked at the gate, checked the property markers, and called me. I walked down with a bag of cookies and a receipt showing I was the property owner. The locksmith laughed, took a cookie, and left without touching a thing. That night, I installed a fishing chair behind the gate, sat there with a cooler and a book, enjoying the breeze. Occasionally, HOA residents walked by, looking sheepish. A few waved, one dropped off a six-pack, and thanked me for standing up to the nonsense. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about principle. If Linda wanted control, she could go find it somewhere else. Here, on this side of the gate, I was the one with the key. By the time July rolled around, the battle lines were drawn in invisible ink, only visible to those of us living it every day. The gate had become more than a physical barrier, it was a symbol. For me, it stood for boundaries, ownership, and the sweet taste of poetic justice. For Linda, it was a humiliating monument to her overreach, a daily reminder that her grasp had exceeded her reach. But just because she'd been beaten on the ground didn't mean she was done. Oh no, she had plans. And I saw them start to unfold with a silence that was somehow more ominous than any shouting match. It started with boats, not mine, of course. I couldn't even get mine into the water without lifting it over the gate like a circus act. These were HOA boats, paddle boats, and small skiffs drifting in from the far end of the lake. At first, I thought it was innocent, just kids out enjoying the water. But then I started seeing the same people docking at the backside of my property, stepping onto the land like it was a park. I approached one couple who looked genuinely confused when I asked what they were doing. "Oh, we were told this area is part of the community lakefront," the man said, holding a little picnic basket. "Linda sent out a newsletter about the new boat landing zones." I nodded, slowly. And did she mention who owns this piece of land you're standing on? His wife blinked. Wait, you own this? I pointed to the sign still bolted to the fence, now with a small addition, private property. Parcel number 2483. Trespassing not permitted. I'd added it after the third boat landed. Things escalated when a row of boys appeared in the water, bright orange, strung with netting like a floating fence. They cordoned off the side of the lake near my dock. The sign attached to them read, Community Swim Area. HOA members only. That's when I knew we were entering a new phase of this ridiculous war. Linda had decided if she couldn't win on land, she'd try to reclaim territory by water. I called the county again. They sent a representative out to inspect the property lines and water access zones. The verdict was clear. The HOA had no legal jurisdiction over navigable waters. The boys were unauthorized, and within a week they were gone. I didn't even have to do anything, but that only seemed to push Linda deeper into her spiral. The next week, a teenage neighbor slipped me a folder. He handed it over like it contained state secrets. Inside were scans of the most recent HOA meeting minutes, which his mom had printed and left out on the kitchen table. The notes were gold. Megan had objected multiple times to Linda's decisions, and Linda had steamrolled right over her. More interesting, though, was the language used references to potential lawsuits against me, a reclamation strategy, and a proposal to designate the disputed strip as common greenway space through a contested vote. I couldn't believe it. She was trying to vote her way back into ownership of land I bought outright. It was time to stop reacting and start pressing buttons of my own. I called up an old buddy of mine, Brian, an engineer like me but with a much more interesting current job. He worked for the Municipal Zoning and Planning Office. After a coffee and a chat, we pulled up some ancient property records and found something fascinating. Because the strip of land I purchased was less than 6 feet wide in some places and was not being used for essential infrastructure, it qualified for reclassification under the state's non-commercial preservation clause. In short, I could apply to make the parcel a restricted access eco-habitat. Brian helped me draft the paperwork, and within 2 weeks, my land, my beautiful little sliver of victory, was no longer just private. It was now legally protected. No development, no events, no gatherings, not even temporary setups without a formal permit. The gate, the dock, the entire strip was now designated as an environmental rest corridor, complete with a sign from the county. The reaction from the HOA was swift and panicked. An emergency meeting was called, and Linda tried to rally the troops, but this time they weren't having it. Residents were tired, the board was split, and Megan, bless her, came to me the next day to deliver news that made me laugh so hard I nearly fell off my porch swing. She tried to stage a vote to override your classification, she said between gasps, said it was unfair and bad faith action. And I read the county ordinance to everyone, said you followed every rule, and even paid for the application fee yourself. The motion didn't even get a second. She handed me a cookie from the meeting oatmeal raisin, but I forgave her. Over the next week, the tension bubbled like a kettle left on too long. Linda refused to give up. She walked the property line daily, muttering into her phone, snapping photos like she was gathering evidence for a crime no one committed. Then one day, I caught her red-handed. I was out back watering my garden when I noticed movement near the fence. There she was, crouched by the gate, screwdriver in hand, trying to loosen the hinges. I walked over slowly, not saying a word, and just stood behind her. She didn't notice me until the light shifted and my shadow fell across her back. She froze. "Looking for something?" I asked. She turned, still crouched, caught mid-wrench. "Oh, I was just inspecting the damage. Some resident said the gate was unsafe." "Funny," I said. "The camera says no one's touched it but you." She blinked. "You installed a camera? It's legal on my property. Also has a pretty decent microphone." Linda stood, brushing her knees, trying to recover her dignity. "You're being extremely uncooperative, you know. And you're lucky I don't charge admission," I said, pointing to the sign. "You're welcome to leave before the county adds trespassing to your list." She left, cheeks flushed, steps clipped and stiff. I watched her disappear around the bend, shaking my head. She was unraveling. The final blow came the next week, when Megan gathered enough board votes to call a full audit of HOA spending. Turns out Linda had allocated over $8,000 to fencing and safety enhancements, without proper documentation or approvals. including, in that line item, a weekend board stress retreat at a local spa booked under her niece's name. The board suspended her pending investigation. She resigned 2 days later, blaming a toxic environment. Word spread fast. Residents started stopping by to thank me, bringing pies, 6 packs, and even one hand-painted sign that read, "Local legend, gatekeeper of Hemlock." I put it up next to my fishing chair. Peace returned slowly, like the lake healing after a storm. The boys never came back. The gate stayed locked, but always open for the kids who wanted to fish, or the elderly couple who just liked to sit near the water. I had a stack of laminated permission slips for guests, and anyone respectful enough to ask got one. As for the HOA, well, they'd started drafting a new charter one, with fewer gate metaphors and a lot more neighborly common sense. And I finally got back to fishing, just when I thought things had finally settled into a peaceful rhythm. Linda made her return not physically, but digitally, like a villain in a straight-to-streaming sequel nobody asked for. She popped up online with the fervor of a conspiracy theorist and the editing skills of a teenager with Wi-Fi. Her new crusade? A campaign she called Save Our Shoreline, complete with a Facebook group, a YouTube channel, and a series of increasingly unhinged TikToks filmed in her backyard, which was now 3 states away. Apparently, she'd moved to Florida, but distance hadn't dulled her thirst for drama. If anything, it sharpened it. The videos were something to behold. In one, she stood in front of a green screen backdrop of Hemlock Lake, declaring that an entitled non-member had seized sacred community land and fenced it off like a tyrant. She showed blurry screenshots of my gate, labeled with words like greedy, anti-neighbor, and my personal favorite, gate goblin. Another video featured dramatic music and slideshows of the lake over the years, intercut with stock footage of crying children and ducks, real ducks, quacking in confusion. Her finale was a full-blown monologue under stormy sky filters, ranting about how one man weaponized bureaucracy to oppress an entire neighborhood. I would have ignored it if it hadn't started picking up traction. Some video got picked up by a mid-level outrage blogger, and suddenly my quiet little fence was trending. People began sharing the clips under hashtags like #LakeLockdown and #FreeTheDock. Strangers commented on my public property record. One even left a voicemail asking how much I charged to rent the land back to the community. Another guy offered to do a documentary. He said he was from Oregon. I asked if he'd ever been to Hemlock Lake. He said no, but injustice is universal. At first, I was furious. I hadn't asked for fame, infamy, or any kind of spotlight. I just wanted to fish, sit by the water, and not have to argue with power-hungry people wielding clipboards. But then something unexpected happened. The internet, that great swirling tide of chaos and memes, turned on Linda. Reddit threads popped up dissecting her videos, pointing out inconsistencies, and her long history of HOA complaints from previous residences. Someone found a Yelp review she'd left for a nail salon that read like a manifesto. Another thread, titled, "Linda tried to fence a lake and got wrecked by a fishing grandpa," made it to the front page. They turned me into a meme. A photo of me in my fishing chair, holding a lemonade, became captioned with things like "You shall not bass" and "Gatekeeping done right." A local news station even reached out. They wanted to do a feel-good segment. I politely declined, not wanting more attention. Still, they aired a story based on public records and included a zoomed-in image of the property deed with dramatic narration. Megan called me afterward, laughing so hard she could barely speak. "It's official," she said between gasps. "You're Hemlock's first viral legend." The attention died down after a while, as all internet things do, but the consequences for Linda didn't. The renewed interest triggered a closer look at her time in the HOA. A few residents she'd previously alienated stepped forward with complaints that had been dismissed or ignored, misuse of funds, false citations, and manipulation of board votes. It wasn't enough for criminal charges, but it was enough to blacklist her from ever holding an HOA leadership role again, not just in Hemlock Shores, but across several statewide community networks. And then, in a move that nearly made me spit out my coffee, the county sent her a fine. Turns out some of her unauthorized installations and her forged permit application for the original gate qualified as zoning violations. She'd signed a document claiming the land was HOA controlled when it wasn't. That fine? Close to $10,000, plus legal fees. Linda's online presence went quiet. Not long after that, no more rants, no more green screen lakes. She posted one last cryptic message, moving on to better waters. I assumed that meant some gated condo complex in Boca Raton. Back in Hemlock, things were finally starting to breathe again. Megan and the new board were hard at work rewriting HOA policies with a focus on transparency and neighborhood inclusion. She even invited me to one of their sessions, not as a member, but as a consultant. I declined the official invitation, but agreed to swing by with donuts and sarcasm, which seemed like a fair trade. One morning, I walked down to the gate and decided to make one final change. I removed the heavy-duty padlock and left the gate wide open. In its place, I installed a small post with a laminated sign that read, "Access granted by courtesy. Respect earns welcome. Entitlement earns nothing." It wasn't a legal restriction anymore, it was a test of character, and you'd be surprised how many people actually asked before stepping through. That week, I got a knock on the door from a teenage boy I hadn't seen before. He introduced himself as Mason, said his family just moved in, and he heard I owned the best fishing spot on the lake. "I'm not going to lie," he said nervously. "My friends dared me to sneak in, but my grandpa always said the right way is slower, but doesn't burn bridges." I looked at him for a moment, then handed him a permission slip I kept in a folder under my porch swing. "Welcome to the lake, Mason," I said. "Just clean up your bait wrappers and don't scare the fish." His grin could have lit up a room. The next few weeks were peaceful in a way I hadn't felt since I first moved here. Kids fished, retirees walked along the shore. Even the raccoon seemed less aggressive. The gate stood open, but its story lingered like ripples on water. And in a strange twist, people actually started treating the area with more respect than they ever had before. Maybe it was the story, maybe it was the quiet symbolism, or maybe they just didn't want to end up in one of my revenge tales. I got a letter in the mail shortly after from Linda. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an apology either. It was weirdly formal. She said she had re-evaluated her relationship with leadership roles and was working with advocacy groups to prevent HOA abuse in her new state. She included a pamphlet for one such group and a handwritten note that read, "We might have started as enemies, but maybe we both taught each other something." I didn't respond. I figured letting it end there was more powerful than anything I could write. Besides, I had fish to catch. And so the gate remained, weathered, sturdy, slightly off-kilter from years of drama, but open. Not because I had to, but because I could. The irony wasn't lost on me. A fence meant to keep me out had become a symbol of who could come in. And the key wasn't made of metal, it was made of manners. 1 year later, to the day, I stood on my dock with a thermos in one hand and a fishing pole in the other, staring at the same patch of lake that had once been the center of one of the most ridiculous property disputes in county history. The gate still stood, though the paint had faded a bit and the metal had taken on a rustic charm that gave it character. I'd left it there on purpose, not to gloat, not even as a warning, but because it had become a part of the story. And sometimes, symbols matter more than structures. What used to be a barrier was now a curious monument, a kind of lakeside landmark. People used to tell stories about overcookouts and community potlucks. Megan had organized a Lake Appreciation Day, a low-key celebration, to honor the efforts made to clean up the shoreline, revise the HOA bylaws, and recognize the neighbors who had come together when things went sideways. To my complete and utter horror, she also included a surprise segment she called Hemlock Legends. I didn't know this until I heard my name being called through a megaphone and turned to see a small crowd applauding as kids held up hand-painted signs that said things like "Thanks, Gate Guy," and "We love the dock." One even drew a cartoon of me with a fishing hat and a laser beam shooting out of the gate. I still don't understand the laser part, but it was impressive artwork. I tried to wave them off, but Megan dragged me up to the front and handed me a plaque, real wood, carved with in recognition of community integrity and unmatched patience. I was half expecting it to say, "Most likely to cause petty chaos," but it was actually tasteful. A kid asked if I was going to write a book about everything. I told him if I did, it'd be titled Linda and the Fence That Couldn't. As I stood there, surrounded by laughing neighbors and the smell of barbecue drifting across the lawn, I realized something strange had happened. Somewhere between the property disputes, internet fame, and HOA meetings gone off the rails, we'd actually become a better neighborhood. People talked to each other now. We shared tools, recipes, and the occasional gossip. The board was transparent, the rules were clear, and most importantly, there hadn't been a single gate-related incident in 6 months. That was practically a miracle. Later that afternoon, Mason showed up again. He'd grown an inch or two, and this time, he brought his younger sister to fish with him. I gave her a mini rod I had lying around and showed her how to bait a hook without flinching. She caught her first bluegill within 10 minutes and screamed so loudly, you'd think she hooked a shark. Mason gave me a thumbs up from across the dock, and for a moment, everything felt exactly right. Then, of course, came the twist. Around sunset, a silver sedan pulled up near the end of the road, and a woman stepped out in sunglasses, a floral scarf, and flats that were way too white for a place with dirt paths. She walked slowly, deliberately, taking in the view. People noticed, went quiet. Someone whispered, and I caught the name before it even reached me. Linda. She stood by the gate, looking at it like someone visiting the ghost of a bad decision. To her credit, she didn't approach anyone or try to make a scene. She just stared at the water for a while, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small box. She opened it, looked inside, then closed it again without taking anything out. I didn't move, didn't say a word. Part of me expected her to shout something, maybe demand an apology, or start filming, but she just turned back toward the car, paused, and looked at me. Her voice wasn't loud. Still got the key? I raised my thermos slightly in acknowledgement. Still don't need to use it. She gave the faintest nod, then turned and left. No dramatics, no swan song, just a quiet exit stage left. The moment passed, and the conversations resumed. Megan came over and asked if I was okay. I shrugged. Honestly, it didn't bother me. People change, or they don't. Either way, it wasn't my job to make sense of it. My job was to watch the water, make sure the kids didn't hook each other, and keep the chairs from sinking into the mud. That night, as the sun dipped below the tree line and the lake shimmered gold and orange, a few of us stayed behind to roast marshmallows. Mason told a dramatic retelling of the Great Gate War using stick figures and fire pokers. A retired couple offered me homemade apple pie as thanks for helping steer the HOA away from disaster. I didn't do much, I told them. I just stood my ground. They disagreed. Eventually, the crowd thinned out, and I found myself alone again, sitting in my weathered chair, the lake whispering its quiet lullaby. I looked at the open gate, the plaque on the post, and the worn trail where hundreds of respectful feet had passed. It was funny, a year ago, I had been locked out. Now people were walking through freely, but on my terms, under one simple rule: don't be a jerk. I thought about how far things had come, about the angry emails, the rogue locksmith, the viral memes, and the zoning paperwork that could have passed for an undergraduate thesis. I thought about how a ridiculous little fence turned into a story of pride, petty battles, community rebellion, and accidental heroism. And through it all, the lake never changed. It just kept shimmering, waiting, patient. Just before heading in, I reached into the little tackle box I kept by my feet and pulled out the original padlock. Linda had installed on the gate. I'd kept it as a reminder. It was rusted now, frozen shut from time and rain. I placed it on the gate post and left it there, a silent trophy, a relic of a time when lines were drawn in metal instead of kindness. As I turned back toward the house, porch light glowing warm in the dark, I heard footsteps behind me. Mason again, jogging up. "Hey," he said, out of breath. "You coming to the late-night fish-off tomorrow?" I smiled. "Wouldn't miss it." "Cool," he said, then paused. "Also, someone put your fishing hat on the HOA bulletin board as a joke. Like, stapled it." I raised an eyebrow. "Was it you?" "Maybe," he said, grinning. "Community art, right?" I chuckled. "Remind me to charge you rent next time." And with that, I headed inside, the sounds of laughter still echoing faintly behind me. The lake stayed quiet, the gate stood open, and the story that started with a lock ended with something much better, a legacy not just of property rights or neighborhood battles, but of standing up, staying patient, and knowing that sometimes the best key isn't one you hold in your hand. It's the one you give away freely, with a little bit of trust and a whole lot of wisdom.